Rosemary and white wine was also widely advertised to make you look young. And so one thing we were interested in the lab when we were testing the rosemary and white wine on the skin is, what does it do? Is this moisturizing? Does it tighten the skin? And that gives us insight into what they conceived as beautiful.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news, and opinion from arts academics at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora koutou. Ko Julianne Evans aho. I'm Julianne Evans, the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts, and today I'm chatting to Associate Professor Erin Griffey, an art historian who specialises in visual culture in the early modern period, which I believe is 1500 to 1700, in particular beauty culture in early modern Europe and in the courts of the Tudors and the Stuarts. Erin's currently writing a book, Facing Decay, Beauty, Wrinkles and Anti-Aging in Early Modern Europe for Penn State University Press, which extends to collaborating with colleagues in chemistry here at the University of Auckland, Waipapa Taumataro, on a thing called the Beautiful Chemistry Project, which is a fascinating experiment that involves choosing early modern cosmetic recipes used by the likes of queens and princesses in the courts of Europe and testing them out in the lab and even trying them on herself. Hello, Erin. Welcome and lovely to talk to you.
Kia ora. Thank you, Julianne.
I'd love to hear more about your book to start with, and then maybe you can continue on with that chemistry project, which is very fascinating. I've actually seen the results of it. I've seen you make it, in fact.
Yes. Well, the book grew out of this broader beauty project, which involved, at the very early stages, going through a whole raft of sources, really going from ancient Egyptian sources through around the year 1800 and culling these sources for any kind of beautifying recipes. And this includes things for wrinkles, but also a number of treatments for skin problems like pimples or redness, but also extends more broadly to what we might see as sort of more decorative treatments like dyeing your hair. And so I endeavored to assemble a database of these recipes, and it just became unwieldy. There were just too many. And so I decided it would be far more productive to focus on one particular type of recipe. And so started a new database focusing purely on recipes that target wrinkles or mention that these recipes will rejuvenate your skin. And so that database has been compiled, and that became the basis that inspired me writing this book on the approaches to anti-aging and wrinkle treatments in early modern Europe. And so part of the book very much engages with the recipes and the science of the recipes, which is why I got involved and developed the Beautiful Chemistry Project with colleagues in science. But another part of the book just looks at the culture and the broader societal perceptions around aging. And I should underscore, too, that my focus really is on women and aging and anxiety about aging, but also this big youth culture, this adoration of what people have said in reference to Elizabeth, the Tudor queen, this mask of youth. And so my prevailing research questions were, what were attitudes toward aging? How is this manifested culturally in all sorts of different cultural forms, whether you're talking about art or literature or philosophy, but also medical treatises. And then to ask, what practical steps did they take to try to turn back the hands of time?
Because they wouldn't have been very old anyway, would they? I mean, they didn't live to a great age. So when did they start thinking that they were getting too old? What was that sort of in their 20s or?
Well, it's a good question. So the age they perceived as being sort of the ideal age was roughly from around the age of 15 to 25. And I suspect this is not all too dissimilar to ideas of ideal beauty in our culture today as well. And these are the years that coincide, and indeed did coincide in those days too, with menstruation and marriage, courting within the context of marriage. A woman's fertility was such a key aspect of her societal value. And this fertility was seen, and broader health was seen to manifest in the condition of the body. And by the condition of the body, I mean things like smooth, radiant skin that had a lovely blush on the apples of the cheeks, but also things like shiny hair, the condition of your body not being too thin or too big. This was also seen as a potential liability. And so in terms of showcasing health, beauty was inextricably related to health. And so within that time period, it was seen to be particularly critical. And so you might think that you were on a downward slope
after 25.
After that, yes. But it's interesting. There are a number of women who did live to a very advanced age. And we know that from a whole host of historical documents. And we also have some really fascinating insight into women's attitudes toward their own aging, whether it's in personal writings, in what other people write about their aging and the signs of their aging. But we also see it in artworks. So if you study portraits, you'll notice that quite a number of portraits are not just dated with the year they were produced, but the age of the person when they were painted. And that's been really fascinating for me because I can look at a woman who, say, was painted at the age of 40 years old, and then I look to see, are there signs of aging that are represented potentially in a naturalistic way, or has the artist tried to compensate by smoothing over some of those signs of age because of broader social anxiety? So I guess a key point is simply that beauty and health were really closely related. And so to dismiss these beauty products as solely the domain of these vain women is, I think, quite unfair because these treatments were actually, a lot of them are conceived as medicines. And they were seen to penetrate the skin and inform the broader harmony of the health of the body. So beauty is not just
skin deep.
Yeah.
And did they do that, do you think, or were they just advertised as doing that? I mean, could they do, could a cream go into the skin and affect the health of the body?
We know today that through transdermal patches that are used widely in medicine today, that active ingredients can be really powerful on overall bodily health. And we know from testing some of these Renaissance beauty products in the lab, we know that they are very much penetrating into the skin and making an impact at that cellular level on the health of the skin.
What are some of these potions and lotions that you tried out? Because I could imagine that some of them are things we would today still use in beauty products. Would that be right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. So if you look at the ingredients in historical products used on the skin this is from ancient Egypt and into the period I'm studying to around the 18th century. Most of them are familiar to us. If you were to ask a cosmetic chemist who formulates beauty products, they would also find lots of parallels with formulations today. What is really interesting to me is really two things in that respect. One is some ingredients being found much more pervasively in old recipes and not commonly today, because that's really exciting to me. And I think, is this elixir that should, be included in far more beauty, cosmetics today? And the other thing that's really intrigued me is to find what I call sticky recipes. And I use that term to describe recipes that just occur again and again and again across a wide range of different types of sources. We're talking manuscript sources, printed sources from many, many different countries and time periods. And those are the recipes I was really keen to recreate and test in the lab, because I thought there must have been something in them for them to be repeated so much. And a devil's advocate could say they were really interesting recipes and they were quite novel, and that's why they're repeated. Others might say that they're repeated a lot because they were effective. And indeed, a lot of the recipes will say, this has been proved, or I have used it, or I have used it on this particular woman who lived to the age of 80 years, but actually only appeared 40 years old. Yes.
What were some of them then? What are some of these
Okay.
ingredients?
Okay. So two that we tested that were particularly sticky was rosemary flowers in white wine. And a lot of beauty recipes today use rosemary leaves, but the flowers
Seldom.
Yes, very, very sparse. And so we tested that in the lab. We recreated the recipe, but we were also interested to compare doing the same recipe with the leaves to the flowers to see if it was different, and it is different, and that's a recipe that's widely promoted for general beautifying. This will make you beautiful. So that's a very common enjoinder in the recipes. This will make you beautiful. Rosemary and white wine was also widely advertised to make you look young. And so one thing we were interested in the lab when we were testing the rosemary and white wine on the skin is, what does it do? Is this moisturizing? Does it tighten the skin? And that gives us insight into what they conceived as beautiful. And when we applied this to our skin, it gives a slight sheen, almost like sparkles far too strong, but a slight, I would say, a film on the skin. It has a lovely scent, and I think that's quite an important point, that a lot of these formulations are scented. And we might say today, oh, they must have smelt, rotten, or they must have been unctuous. Certainly the ones that we prepared in the lab are very subtle. And often when you're distilling, you're using distilling equipment, the smells become really quite soft and beautiful. And
they didn't drink it, you're sure about that?
Well, we do know that they recommended rosemary and white wine to drink and to apply to the skin. And so this is an example of something that you could imbibe, and it would make you vigorous and healthy and youthful. But it was also something you could apply to your skin. But so fascinating that they specify the flowers. So you can imagine we're out there. So I'm out there just picking the flowers off of rosemary. And so it gave us so much insight into the types of formulas, the smells, the textures, testing to see what the impact was on the skin. And I'll give you a little one of the outcomes that we noticed, and this is just empirically observing in the lab, was that it lightened spots on the skin. So there were 3 of us testing the recipe, and one of us has some freckles, and we noticed that they were lightened in the area where
you applied it.
Yes.
And that was just for one application.
Oh, no, not for one application.
No.
So this was all done under very, strict protocols of how these sort of formulas should be tested. So it was tested over a month. Yeah.
Are you the first person to ever do this, do you think?
I think there are so many people who are interested in historical beauty recipes. And I am sure, and I know that people have recreated them, but I think we might be the first to go to that next step in recreating them in a lab and having them analyzed, the chemical composition analyzed, and then doing these very rigorous skin tests, and then again analyzing the impact on the skin with the latest tools.
And presumably these particular potions, while they might have been used by women across those centuries, particularly were of interest to women who had time and leisure and an enormous amount to gain by being beautiful. And I'm guessing that's leading us to the queens of those courts, princesses and highborn ladies, including someone who I know is of great interest to you, and you've studied her very specifically, Queen Henrietta Maria. Can you talk a bit about Queen Henrietta and why she is so fascinating to you in particular?
Yes, I'm happy to. Before I get to Henrietta Maria, I just want to make a point about broader access to beauty recipes. And I think you're right. We definitely find lots of evidence that, or accounts, references to elite women using these types of recipes. Recipes will reference a queen. This was used by this queen or this noblewoman. And when I get to Henrietta Maria, I can tell you that there are prescriptions for beauty treatments by her physician that survive. However, many of these recipes pervaded society far more broadly. And the evidence for that is you can find very, very cheap compilations of recipes written in the vernacular, so written in Italian or English, and would have been very inexpensive to buy. And those little mini pamphlets often include beauty recipes. And they might include something like rosemary and white wine. That's a recipe that's far more accessible than some of these other recipes that include really, really expensive ingredients.
Like, for example,
some recipes include, some of the really expensive ingredients were saffron, for example. Myrrh was really expensive. Sometimes you find pearls used in recipes. So these are recipes that would be limited to far wealthier women. But there are fascinating access points for people from other social classes, which show that there was an interest in doing these recipes. And when I've gone through the recipes, I've been sensitive to issues of access and price point, and some of them were things you could even create from your kitchen garden, and others you would need an apothecary to actually create for you.
So Henrietta Maria,
yes,
your favourite subject, or one of them.
Yes.
We haven't got a lot more time. Can you briefly tell us about her and your engagement with her over these last years?
Yes, sure. So Henrietta Maria, for me, is just one of the most fascinating historical women. And this is in part because she was such a polarizing figure, but also quite a feisty one. And she is basically studying Henrietta Maria gives you just enormous insight into the whole time in which she lived. So she's French by birth. She's a Bourbon princess. She's the daughter of Henri IV, Henry IV, and Marie de Medici. And she's the youngest daughter. And she ends up marrying the English king, Charles I, and at age 15 comes to England. And this was a monumental event on so many levels, but most notable because she is the first Catholic to marry a Protestant king. And so this ignites an enormous amount of debate, anxiety, seething around England, but also a lot of hope from people like her godfather, Pope Urban VIII, about maybe the potential of even converting England to Catholicism. But it's not all a religious story with Henrietta Maria, but you could take that path. She was a big shopper. She had
a big wardrobe, didn't she?
Big wardrobe, very refined tastes in clothes, and so much of that evidence, so many of those accounts survive, which really bring that to life. She was, just a very powerful player in culture more broadly. And for me, too, she's fascinating because she's just crossing so many boundaries, England and France, Catholicism and Protestantism, all of these issues that are so key to understanding the period.
And she was painted a lot, wasn't she?
She was painted quite a number of times by Van Dyck, a spectacular painter active at the court of Charles I. And I should add that Henrietta Maria was the principal painter to Charles I and Henrietta Maria. He's often described as Charles's painter, but officially he was also Henrietta Maria's painter as well. So as you can imagine, if you tend to do a lot of research on one historical figure, it's great because you can approach them from all sorts of different angles. And I did a book on her in terms of material culture, which is called On Display. And since that book has come out, I've just tried to approach her from essentially every other angle I can think of. And so I thought, what about beauty?
Which brings us back to our topic.
Yes, which brings us back to our topic. And so I started working with these medical case notes from one of her physicians, Theodore de Mayerne. And these medical case notes describe his prescriptions for her, but a number of health problems she had over the years. And they're fascinating because they were when she was young and she was trying to get pregnant. And that's the subject of a chapter that's just recently come out, which maybe we'll get to at the very end. But these case notes include beauty recipes as well. Yes.
And was she a great user of recipes and beautifying things? I'm sure she was.
Well, I assume she used some of these products. What I have are a few prescriptions. Okay, so this suggests that she was using these things, but in terms of evidence, right? It's a tricky one. One lovely thing is, so there's a prescription for a rash to treat a rash on her skin. And for me, that's a beauty treatment. But we might also more broadly refer to this too as a dermatological issue. And she had a rash on her cheek. And in the margin, he tells us when she applied this. So that, I guess, that's pretty compelling evidence, right, that it was used, because he gives the exact date that it was used.
Where did you find this information, Erin? Was it hard to find, or was it in books, or was it in?
So Mayern's case notes, they're manuscripts. So they're his handwritten manuscripts that he kept.
In the 1600s.
Yes, this is in the 1600s, and he includes medical treatments he did for both Anna of Denmark, who was the previous queen consort, as well as medical treatments for Henrietta Maria. Unfortunately, only for a very short period. So I don't have access to Henrietta Maria's case notes throughout her life. So one has to assume, right, that other physicians were also prescribing these types of things. But I go into this in a lot more depth in the publications.
Staying on the theme of beauty and of Henrietta Maria as well, I believe you have written a chapter of a very wonderful book called Floral Culture in the Tudor and Stuart Courts, edited by Susanna Lyon Whaley. And you supervised her PhD, I believe, but she's now in the UK. Tell me about that particular chapter, because it revolves around Henrietta Maria, doesn't it?
It does, and it follows on from what we were talking about, those case notes from Theodore de Mayerne. And it makes the point that a lot of these prescriptions relate to her trying to get pregnant, but also other prescriptions relate to beauty and skin-related issues. And it fits within a volume on floral culture. And this relates back to the rosemary flowers, that flowers are everywhere in these recipes.
And in the paintings as well.
And in the paintings as well. And that's precisely the point. Fresh flowers, dried flowers, distilled flowers, you name it, the roots, the leaves, the flowers, every bit of flowers were pervasive in these recipes, but also in the lives of early modern people.
Is that because they sought out the rare and the special and the exotic? Did that connect in with going around the world and explorers finding these new beautiful flowers, or were they local flowers?
It's a real mix in terms of the recipes. Yes. So some recipes, again, have very accessible flowers. Others have a wide range of plants that would be far more difficult to obtain, and you would need to go to the apothecary to get those. And someone like Henrietta Maria with Theodore de Mayerne, and she had her own apothecary, Pierre de Plancy, they could ensure that her treatments were made of this broad medley of different ingredients. And some might be local and some might be imported from far beyond the seas.
It seems to me that women have always had to be young and beautiful. That's what, really, if we're thinking about modern relevance of all of this, not just highborn women, but the enormous pressure on women to look a certain way and to attain an ideal sort of concept of beauty. Have we come any further, or are we still? We're still in this, aren't we? Men just don't have this problem.
Oh, there's a lot to unpack in that. First of all, I'd say that men too are implicated in some of this, in these sources. They couldn't just let themselves go. The other thing to say is just more broadly, you're absolutely right. This sort of cult of youthful appearance, it just seems to cross time and culture, throughout societies from ancient times. But I think a common misconception is that these beauty treatments were focused on masking And this is this idea too, this mask of youth idea with Elizabeth I. And the idea there is that you're covering something up. And so through beauty, it's all about hiding what you really look like underneath. But in fact, that was never the goal of beauty. It was enhancing what you already have and actually transforming the skin to make you look naturally
Gorgeous.
healthy, beautiful. These are synonymous. Healthy, beautiful, youthful, they're synonymous. But if someone was to paste a thick layer of white masking makeup and some thick red unctuous rouge, this was never, ever seen as attractive. What they were after, and this is whether you're talking about the Renaissance or today, they were after what we would call and what they would call the natural look.
That's interesting because Elizabeth I, of course, didn't do that, did she?
Well, we don't know.
No.
But the evidence about Elizabeth using
Lead-based
lead
paint.
is very minimal and comes from someone who had a lot to gain from accusing her of that. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But the goal was to look luminous, smooth, what they would call well-colored, and that's not having pale skin. Pale skin was bad. Pale skin has, it's light, bright, and has a rosy cheeks and rosy glow. Yeah.
Look, it's been so fascinating. I feel like we could keep on talking for hours. But just in the interests of the audience, how can we read more and find out more about all of this? Your book, the one I mentioned at the beginning, which I'll say again, Facing Decay, Beauty, Wrinkles and Anti-Aging in Early Modern Europe. When is that coming out?
Well, it's forthcoming. It's in its final stages. So we'll have to circulate the specifics when that's clear. So that's hopefully reasonably imminent, but there are a lot of publications already, chapters and articles that I've written on many different aspects of beauty in the early modern period.
Including the Floral Culture book, which people can read now.
That's exactly right. So the Floral Culture only came out in February, and it is brilliant and well worth a read.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Erin.
Thank you, Julianne.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts by following us on social media.